So, John Henry Newman, September 1833, he says, "Choose your side, since you must shortly choose one or the other party, even if you do nothing." What readers were asked to choose in that first tract was a Catholic view of the Church, its ministry, and its sacraments. Initially, the Oxford movement was not primarily about ritual or liturgy or architecture, though it came to influence all of those. Its emphases were theological. It was concerned with the doctrine of the Church, with ecclesiology. What does it mean to be church? The concern of the Oxford reformers was for the visible church, not the invisible church of Augustine or later Martin Luther, but the visible church. The visible church as the very ship of salvation and the means of grace that it proffered. According to the Tractarians in the Oxford movement, the historic episcopate was the guarantor of that role. The Oxford reformers sought to articulate their doctrine. As they sought to articulate their doctrine of the Church, they ultimately insisted upon a return to the faith set forth in the ecumenical councils of the undivided Church and of the early Church Fathers. So they're concerned to look at the documents from the 1st through the 5th centuries, to documents that dealt with episcopacy and with the establishment of orthodoxy in the great councils of the Church, and to recover the Church's authority by carefully examining those. As they probed the writings of those fathers, they called Christians to a renewed sense of Christian discipline, to reverence for worship and devotion, and to lives of personal holiness. Here again, the emphasis was on older, one would think of as Catholic literature as opposed to Protestant Reformed literature, and to older Catholic practice rather than to the practice that emerged as a result of the Protestant Reformation. People heeded Newman. They chose sides. Some followed Keble, with his desire for a church that looked like it did in the days of Charles I and Charles II of England. Very Catholic. Other people followed Pusey's concept of the church as the via media between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. But others sided with the more restless camp that had its ties to John Henry Newman, and they moved away from the very idea of an autonomous Church of England toward submission to the Pope, toward reunification with the Roman Catholic Church. So, in conclusion, by the mid-19th century, one can and must speak of parties within American Episcopalianism. There were the evangelicals, which I've talked about earlier, and there were the high churchmen, and there were the sympathizers with the Oxford movement. One is surprised that there wasn't a schism in mid-19th century American Episcopalianism. The closest that these opposing forces came to a resolution of their contrarieties was probably in the person of the professed evangelical Catholic William Augustus Muhlenberg and the Memorial Movement. He and that movement are discussed really quite nicely in Hine and Shattuck, and we'll come back to them at a future time, a couple of weeks from now. But that's enough on the Oxford movement, just to whet your appetite a bit and to help you understand why the way in which they articulated the relationship between church and state found a very appealing audience in America and continued to have an impact, particularly as you have read in your work this week through the auspices of the General Theological Seminary, but ultimately after the founding of Nashotah House in Wisconsin, the Tractarian movement had a real grounding here in America. And we'll talk more about that as the course proceeds. And of course, I would welcome you to my course on English Reformations, which will deal more extensively with the Oxford movement in the fall.